So we recognize that science is not something magical or either something fixed. It's a man-made social institution. And in the process of becoming the science we know today, it's pushed aside other perspectives on reality, first religion, and then some other options. Science is today mankind's greatest generator of new knowledge, and it's also a verifier of new knowledge regardless of where it comes from. The database is absolutely huge. Science is a major force in modern society, like it or not, and it has many worldly consequences, some good, some bad. Now, science works through the societal paradigm within which we live. And even though the paradigm was initiated by science starting a few hundred years ago, the paradigm now pervades every aspect of modern life. It controls the uses of science, applications. It has many practical effects upon mankind and his planet, and it's prevalent and dominating presence for every one of us, by golly, whether you're a scientist or you're not. It governs how you think about yourself and your place in the world. It sets much of your personal system of values, attitudes, and beliefs. If you don't accept that, just look a little deeper. It strongly influences your ability to discriminate from one thing into the next, and the decisions that you make, and the relationships with people that you set up. It's always there. Well, science is changing now. I think you can agree with that. And the paradigm is changing too, although much slower. It's going to take generations to make a significant shift. Central to all of this is to understand the limitations of science and how they're becoming more apparent with every generation. What are these shortcomings of modern science? Let's spell them out. Many observed anomalous phenomena are taking place for which science has no understanding, explanation, or even, in many cases, any means of exploring. We all know about that one. They're occurring in psychology, parapsychology, the social sciences, and even in quantum physics, where human extension extends well beyond our senses and our instruments. We know that now. The human mind is an active agent in the observations that we're making, the experiments that we're conducting, not especially in healing. The mind is involved, for heaven's sakes. There are instantaneous physical interactions that can occur over great distances, and some effects sometimes precede their causes. Top-down effects are real as much as, if not more than, the bottom-up effects that we get through our reductionism. Something's wrong with randomness. It's not exactly what we think it is. There are hidden factors taking place. Double-blind experiments, well, we've been living by them for a long time, but we find out through our experiments that no one is fully blind. How can you conduct a randomized controlled experiment when everybody knows, at least at a subconscious level, what's going on? The second major shortcoming is that science is based on a set of root metaphysical assumptions that limit what it's qualified to explore. And you know, if your assumptions are violated or not supported, you can't trust your results, right? We require objectivity, measurability, replicability, and we are assuming causality, mainly through reductionism. The third difficulty with science is that it has no built-in set of values to govern inquiry and especially application. Any and all explorations in science are fair game, right? Regardless of the consequences. And this is a sacred right among scientists. And some of those consequences are pretty horrendous, you must agree. Well, how are we going to deal with all this? first we can observe one thing, that there's a serious gap between science and human life. What science is saying about humans and what we know from our own experience as being humans doesn't quite match. So in the human area, science is a weak means for both discovery and validation, the two major activities of science, finding out new potential knowledge and verifying whether knowledge is true or not. So this implies that we're going to have to go back to fundamentals, right? Where does knowledge come from in the first place? How do we gain access to it in order to generate new knowledge? Why do we have to go back? Because the shortcomings of science can't be resolved at the same level of perception at which they become apparent. We've got to step beyond. We need another way of knowing besides the familiar scientific one. This is so we can extend the present-day science into this fuller realm to embrace the mind and human factors as we know them personally so well. So the solution must somehow derive from the subjective, non-material, acausal, mental, and partially timeless domain from which the anomalous potential are arising. We just can't avoid this. We've got to dip in there for our solution. Important to SSE, you're darn right. We're already on the leading edge because we're exploring these many anomalous phenomena and how they're working. We've got to continue doing this. This is our charge. But unfortunately, we're still trying to study these anomalies by using the old methodology, or at least a lot of us are doing this. That's not going to work. So a major focus is needed now on new methodologies, new ways of knowing, new ways of acquiring knowledge. That's our next challenge. Well, what I want to do in the rest of my time is to present another way of acquiring knowledge that we could use, may use in future science, and give evidence as to why it works. Okay? First of all, man possesses, I'll make this as an assertion and try to justify it shortly. Man possesses an innate capacity for accessing new information and knowledge directly without recourse to rationality, sense perception, or memory. It's rightly called intuition, or direct knowing, or innate knowing, or nous, the Greek term from which we get gnosis and noetics. Intuition is a universal faculty of the mind. It's practiced everywhere throughout human history and widely up until the rise of science itself. It's an essential part of thought, but it functions invisibly and in the background. It shows itself in serendipities and insights, revelations, gut feelings, and the others that I've listed here. Mainly, if not entirely, when the intellect is put at rest and turned off momentarily, then it leaks through. Moreover, intuition isn't a special gift that belongs to a few people, but it belongs to everybody. It can be developed intentionally by anyone. There's very good evidence that this is so. Rather few persons choose to develop intuition deliberately, however. There's a class, though, of expert intuitives, I call them, that have done this and developed their intuitive ability into a refined skill. You can do this too if you want to. These expert intuitives have been shown to have access to almost any information. That's a very strong statement, and I hope in the rest of the talk I can show you that it's true. What's the source of this knowledge? Well, it seems to be well known throughout history and in different areas. It's called, in one sense, the collective unconscious. That's Carl Jung, but it also goes by several other names. We don't have to wait for an explanation of the mechanism by which this source is working. We don't We don't ask this for human language, even though we use it every day. But it's there. Mm-hmm. There are popular examples of these expert intuitives who actually are functioning in the world. Many mystics, prophets, artists, scientists, and the best of today's spiritual teachers are functioning with intuition in this very effective way. In the 1980s, at the Center of Applied Intuition in San Francisco, we asked the question, how far can we go in obtaining new knowledge intuitively? What breadth of knowledge and how deeply can we go? And how easy is it to do it? These expert intuitives, we used 10 of them and applied them to 15 unsolved problems that hadn't been accessible to ordinary scientific or other means of solution. The first 4 of them, earthquake triggering, bipolar depression, HIV, and recovery of lost languages, were all open, unsolved problems, and moreover, they were amenable to scientific validation if we could get good answers, okay? Several others were also unsolved, but we were not optimistic about the possibility of solving them. That is, of getting evidence that would show that what we came up with is right. Cause and treatment of sudden infant death syndrome, decontamination of nuclear waste material, recovery of lost history, and biographies of Imhotep and the pre-Christian Jesus. That is the Jesus before the church took him over. Those red spots there indicate that there are books available in the bookstore if you want to pursue either of these further. So information from these first 4 were, the studies were conducted and validated through scientific methods. The last one, business consulting and personal counseling, were self-validated, partially self-validated just through the actual use of them. There are other similar findings that have come from non-CI studies, mineral exploration, archaeology, finding lost objects, military intelligence, medical diagnosis. I think most of you know about these. And these were largely self-verifying. These references are at the bottom, but I'll show them again at the end. First of these 4 areas, which I'm going to discuss as evidence for the effectiveness of intuitive inquiry. In 1975, seismology was virtually at a standstill. The core of the Earth had been roughly mapped, and we knew where earthquakes were occurring all over the globe, so we had a kind of long-range prediction of where they were going to happen next. But we had no short-range prediction at all. A few Earth measurements are being made, where the Earth is how much it's lifting and where and so forth, but it was trivial. So an intuitive consensus study was undertaken on earthquake triggering and its associated precursors. That is, the signals that could be measured to detect what's going on. We used 8 expert intuitives in 1975, 4 in 75, 4 in 1977. Well, the consensus was rich in new information. Here's a paragraph, just as a very random example taken from these studies. I'll let you read it. I won't try to read it myself. Are you able to see it okay? Well, this was incredible at the time. It was totally far out because no one had been looking into the atmosphere or space or electromagnetic phenomena. There were no conceivable mechanisms at hand to explain how they could have anything at all to do with earthquakes. All right? Several new precursors were named, some mechanisms were explained, various cross effects were identified, and there was no contradiction with the firmly established seismological knowledge. So what are we going to do with this? Well, we carried it to the seismologists, but nobody was interested. Not surprising, I suppose. So we published the article in an obscure journal and forgot about it. In 2010, 2011, we did a careful review of intuitive insights conducted by comparing them against published geophysics articles. First in 1975 to show that this information was not already known, and then again in the period up to 2010 to show what had been verified. Almost all the intuitive information was verified by ongoing research in that period. Satellite observations during the 1980s from other geophysical research in the 1990s and 2000s. A few points were still unverified, like the effects of the planets on earthquakes, but nothing was found that was downright wrong. Several new precursors are a good bet for a future earthquake prediction system. Seismology is now a space-based rather than a ground-based operation. It's actually a major subfield of geophysics. Conclusion, if the results of this study had been heeded earlier, it could have saved much confusion and time, that's for sure. The intuitive consensus inquiry could easily be extended now to get more details. Similar studies could greatly benefit future work in geophysics and science generally. Another area, bipolar depression, or manic depression, manic depressive disorder. In 1980, it was an almost complete mystery. There were a few indications of genetic factors involved, and lithium was being used as a partial treatment. Which way to go? An intuitive consensus study was undertaken using 6 expert intuitives to determine the best direction. This work was done with Dr. Paul Groff. Several new insights were obtained on the development of physiology and treatment. Good consensus on many important points. Major findings: the overall problem is terribly complex despite very simple systems, so it's like cancer. Genetic approach would be very difficult and slow. Lithium doses should be reduced. They're too large. In 2009, these findings relative to ongoing search on BD since 1975 was carried out as we did for the earthquakes. Strikingly correct on 10 major insights. Research is still stuck now despite massive data collection and analysis. Much still remains to be verified. Conclusion, intuitive consensus has significant potential for obtaining needed knowledge on mood disorders, psychiatric problems, and medicine generally. Another study was done on AIDS in 1993, and it was verified in 2010. Same sort of thing happened. One of the main conclusions is HIV is an essential contributory to AIDS, but is not its root cause. Are you listening, Henry? The susceptibility lies in the infection. To the infection lies in a severely depressed immune system. Well, we're going to have to skip the recovery of the lost language since we're out of time. Conclusions: almost any needed information can be obtained through intuitive inquiry. The evidence that this is possible is now strong and actually sufficient. There are 4 conditions for its accuracy, coverage, and success, namely, work with only expert intuitives, either yourself or hire an expert intuitive. Either yourself or hire an expert intuitive. The inquiry questions have to be clear, non-presumptive, and objective. No explanations needed. Strong and clear motivation for applying the new knowledge, not just curiosity. And no harmful consequences. If there are any, these will block the information. So this has profound implications for the future of science, for generation of knowledge generally, and of course for the role of SSE in this process. I'll have to skip over the individual challenge and just skip to this point. That's a lot for us as individuals to do. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Time for questions?
Now, any questions on this?
Hi, Ron Westrom. I was editor of a little newsletter for quite a while called The Social Psychology of Science. And I got very interested in intuition and its role in both science and engineering. One of the first things that one notices about this is that it's a very unequally distributed skill, intuition.
Wait, they're very, what?
Unequally distributed. Some people have it in great degree and some people not very much.
Okay.
Typically, people who think of themselves as theorists have an extraordinary degree of intuition. And the level of some people, Tesla would be a fine example of this, is just absolutely amazing in terms of their ability to model in their mind mechanical systems and so forth. That's also something that's, I think, strongly tested by the Myers-Briggs scale, intuitive versus sensor. And I think that's a very interesting thing. Sal Restivo has a book called The Subjective Side of Science and compares the Apollo moon scientists in terms of their love of either data or theory and shows that each one thinks of the others as unscientific.
Yeah. Could I answer that part first before you load my brain with another part of the question?
Yes.
I would say that they are speaking here not about their intuitive ability, but their the way they have actually developed it into something useful. A lot of other work says that we are all equally intuitive. It's just a matter of how much we allow ourselves to be that way, you see? Okay, but go further.
There are other people waiting, so I'm going to just pass on to the next.
This is Bob Patterson. I was just curious, and maybe I missed it, how do you identify who's an expert intuitive, or how did you,
Good
how
question.
did you go about that?
Good question. When we did this work in the 90s, 80s, there were intuitives coming off the wall, so we had there was no lack of applicants. But we screened them pretty carefully, partly to get information which they had no access to, partly of which they might have access to, but we could corroborate with it partially with old things like the history of some ancient individual, and partly by their work on actual applications that we were working on, where we could compare their results with others who had preceded them. This was our way of doing it. But actually this was just a game, because we had a pretty strong intuitive sense of who was doing it and who wasn't.
I have to confess to a certain a priori suspicion of intuition, and to note that a full discussion of your talk would be longer than your talk was, but I will restrain myself to noting that I'm not terribly impressed by the list of scientific confirmations, because at least some of the things you're scoring as hits are Barnum statements that would be true of almost any research program still in progress.
Okay, I'll have to say, I guess the main answer to that is the evidence is sound, but what I can talk about today is certainly not a long list of the arguments for or against. Certainly many well-qualified scientists are authenticating the results that we have. And that would be indication that people who have looked at this carefully are saying, yes, yes, it's right. What I can say now is very limited.
Thank you very much.